Welcome everyone to our webinar. Today's webinar is about safer gambling interactions and how to measure success. I mean, we've been hearing a lot about markers of harm, we've been hearing a lot about detection, but we tend to sometimes forget that once you detect, you need to do something. So today we're going to focus on the interactions part, and I'm very lucky to have quite a good panel here with me that can give quite a lot of different contributions from their different experiences. So we have Dr. Michael Auer, one of the most prolific authors I've seen compared to Mark Griffiths, so he's constantly publishing on this topic. We have Jim Carter from Flutter, so it's really good that we get more of what the operator sees and how they work. And then we have two experience consultants. So we have Claire, who has quite a vast experience of the topic as well, and then who works with Epic Risk Management. We're going to start the webinar by first having Michael present some of his research, so it will set the tone as well for us on what we can discuss. And then once the presentation is done, we'll have a panel discussion. Just to remind you that this will be recorded and it will be available as well on the YouTube channel of EGBA. And ask as many questions as possible. I am the moderator today, so please go ahead and ask very difficult questions because I won't have to answer them myself. So, shall we start, Michael?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. It's great that you're participating, and I have the honor to kick off this webinar with four prolific panel partners. I'm Michael Auer. I'm a researcher and founder of Neccton, and Neccton is an analytics company, responsible gaming compliance software company, which is part of OpenBet since June of this year. And I'm gonna try to make the point that customer interaction is really important, and at the end, hopefully, of my slides, you will think, why didn't we do it before? It's so obvious that it needs to be done. Barry, next slide. All right, so a couple of years ago, I asked myself, how well are players actually able to estimate how much they lost, right? So if we think about the importance of personalized feedback of customer interactions, then we should also analyze or study how aware players are actually of their spendings, of their losses, of their deposits. And this chart here is from a paper from, I think, 2015. So basically every slide you're gonna see refers to one or more of my studies, and of course other studies that have been published. And what you see here is, even with a rather bad eyesight, you will see, a bunch of dots scattered around, a rectangle, and that's basically, the accuracy of players estimating their own losses. And if players were able to estimate their losses accurately, then the dots would be on, a diagonal line from the bottom left to the top right, and it's pretty obvious they are not. So what we find out was that if you ask players how much do you think you lost, and you compare it with their actual behavior that an operator, of course, has recorded, then you will see that players are underestimating their losses, their deposits, and they're overestimating their winnings. And also, interestingly, the more they gamble, the larger this bias between self-perception and actual spending becomes. And that of course, is an immediate call to action for personalized feedback, right? So if we put responsibility on players to gamble responsibly, we need to provide them with the respective tools to be able to do so. And one of those set of tools is feedback about personal spendings. And feedback could also have the form of messages, like real text messages, which are provided online an inbox, pop-up, or on the phone. And in the bottom right corner, I have an example of such a message that we tested, which goes like, how often did you recently gamble? Take a look at your personal dashboard to learn more about your recent activity. And that is a consequence of that basic research that we done. And I published 2 such studies, and 2 other studies were published by Sally Gainsbury, one by Julia Braverman. So we have 5 studies with actual players, asking them how much they spend compared to the real spendings, and all studies come to the same conclusion. Next slide, Barry. So what you see here is how such personalized feedback could look like. This is an example from a site which has integrated, our mentor system. A player navigates there, and then players immediately see how much they won or lost over 730 or an arbitrary period of time, how much money they did withdraw, how often they gambled, how long they gambled. So we have monetary feedback. We have a frequency of play, and then in the middle, you might not be able to read it. It says comparable players. What's happening there is, if players click there, they would learn about how much they are spending compared to peers. Peers with respect to age, peers with respect to gender, peers with respect to the types of games in terms of structural characteristics that they are playing. And in psychology, we call this normative feedback, which means I tell you, this is what you do, this is what comparable individuals are doing. Again, a number of papers have been published that have tested normative feedback with real world players, and also found that normative feedback can lead to behavioral change. Next slide, Barry. And here you see a table from a study which tested like text inbox messages. One of those inbox messages in the bottom right corner: have you been gambling more often recently? Why not complete our self-assessment to understand your playing activity better? So you have to imagine, remember the page before, a gambling operator would provide a player with an inbox, like whatever you want to call it, a self-assessment, like a cockpit, a section on the site where they can learn more about the gambling. And that doesn't only contain numbers or figures or charts, but actual, text messages. And those are not sent out randomly, but those are sent out targeted based on somebody's gambling activity, similar to what, operators and the industry does in the area of CRM, where of course they try to capture the right moment to to intercept with whatever activity, CRM activity there is available. This can also be done and should be done at the backdrop of responsible gaming. And we tested those types of messages, and the messages always address a certain type of extreme behavior or behavior change. So in the table you see high losses, which means it goes out to players which lost a larger amount. High deposit amount goes out to players which have deposited larger amount, but it also goes out to players, for example, which show a certain change in activity. They might have gambled little, or maybe gambled with other operators, transitioned volume to this site here. So you see this increased deposit amount. And then what we did is applying a matched pairs design. So we tried to find similar players which didn't read that type of message, but were similar with respect to age, gender, and gambling activity. And we see that there is a significant effect of those messages. So we of course know when did they read the message, and this the column effect on the total amount bet in the 7 days after the message was read. We see this is larger than 50%. 50% would be like tossing a coin random. There is no difference whether somebody reads the message or not, but we see there is a large impact, especially with the high losses message. So those personalized messages, numerous studies have shown that they lead to a subsequent behavioral change. Barry? Another type of customer interaction are pop-up messages. So before, what I was sort of referring to were inbox messages, and here we also analyzed back in 2013-15 a pop-up message which appeared on the Austrian Win Today online casino site, and that pop-up message came up after players had played 1,000 slot games, which roughly translates to 60 minutes of consecutive gambling. That's like just like technological limitation that the gambling time couldn't be tracked, but rather the number of subsequent games. And what, of course, I was very interested whether this had any impact, and it did have an impact. So what we see here, the red dashed line, you see there is a peak at sort of 1,000. If you go along the horizontal line and you're at the number 1,000, then you see a slight peak. So you see this peak indicates that a significant number of players terminated their session, so they logged out after the pop-up appeared. And then what we did is, that was, you have to remember, almost 10 years ago, we thought, okay, let's sort of beef up that message with various content. One of the content was that we sort of brought in normative feedback. So we said, you played 1,000 games, very few other players play 1,000 games in a session, those kinds of things. Are you sure you'd like to continue, etc., etc.? So we applied normative feedback, restructured the text message in terms of grammatically to fit, for example, with parallel process model, which is a psychological model of communication. And what you see, the difference after sort of optimizing, tuning the message psychologically, we see the blue line. So we see more players stopped to play after the enhanced pop-up came up. However, what we also saw is that only about 1.6% of the players who see the pop-up stop to gamble, and what is it, like 98% of the players continue to play beyond 1,000 games. So we see there is a significant impact. The message can be changed, but still the majority of players did ignore it and continue to play. And that research, of course, is to be continued. More research needs to be published with respect to pop-up messages which appear while somebody is gambling. Next slide, Barry. Another responsive gaming tool sort of that I sign into this category of customer interactions are cool-offs, or you might also call it mandatory play breaks. It's quite common that operators block players temporarily after an extreme session or long session duration, and I think it's common that cool-offs are applied after 60 minutes of continuous gambling time. So before, you saw there was the pop-up which just appears with a message, but here we are talking about a mandatory cool-off. So a player is cut off from gambling for a certain period of time, and we were interested how long should this time actually last. So, and we found out, talking to various operators, that it was quite common that this mandatory play break, this cool-off, lasted for 90 seconds, so 1.5 minutes. And we thought, why is it 90 seconds? So we couldn't find any academic evidence. Obviously, one operator, some time ago decided to use 90 seconds, and everybody sort of fell in line with it. And we had the chance to really test this systematically with randomly assigned players to various groups, and we used 90 seconds, 15 minutes, and 5 minutes. So a number of players which were randomly assigned for a month, they experienced a 90-second play break after 60 minutes of gambling. Another group of players experienced a 5-minute play break, and another group of players a 15-minute play break. And what we did is we tested after the play break, how long did it take them to start gambling again? Because we figured if everybody starts to play again after the play break, it doesn't really make much sense, because the idea of the play break is, of course, to interrupt the session and nudge the player to follow, up another activity and stop gambling maybe for the remainder of the day. And what we found is, you see this on the right side in this box, that after the 90 seconds play break, the majority of the players started to gamble again within a minute. So basically, they waited until the play break was over, then they cool off and started to gamble again. I mean, more than 90%. The same for 5 minutes. So there wasn't not much of a difference between 90 seconds and 5 minutes, but the biggest difference was with respect to 15 minutes. So the 15-minute play break somehow, nudges players to change activity. It's too long to wait in front of the computer to start to gamble again, and they just went and did something else. Of course, we don't know whether they start to gamble with another operator or whatever, so there are lots of limitations here. I'm sure some of you were about to ask that question, but we concluded that a cool-off period should at least last for 15 minutes, and that sort of follow-up papers with similar and the same data set came to the same conclusion. We also then looked into, for example, the buttons down there. So I mean, if there are buttons that would forward somebody to the player protection, to the responsible gaming site, log out, that also had a huge impact. So we found that those buttons are most likely the most helpful thing, because players simply click on it, do something else, their attention is diverted to another activity. So whenever you do something in terms of responsible gaming, be sure not to just show a pop-up with a text, but to include links that players can click, because it's very likely they do so and they change the activity. Next slide, Barry. So, and we go, let's think a little bit beyond, personalized messages on the site. So what we have here, we did this with the Dutch lottery Toto, which has an online casino license in the Netherlands, and they call players and or text them if they are indicative of problematic gambling with respect to the markers of harm that we are using, and which are of course commonly used on the market. And to make a long story short and not drag this out too much, we found that personalized calls as well as text messages had a significant impact on subsequent gambling behavior, because this is a whole different story, right? So we're not talking here about a pop-up message, inbox message, but the operator or a care organization calling players, which is indicative, and that I mean might as well backfire and not have any impact. But in this study, we found that there is a positive impact in terms of responsible gaming. And there is another study with, I think, a Swedish data set, which found similar results. Next one. I think this is my last slide. And this last slide is about another type of nudging. And that nudging actually, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about it here, so I'll keep it short. That nudging kicks in not after somebody lost a lot, but after somebody won. So some of you might be surprised here. Why would we, inform players about their winnings? Because it's a very good point in time, to nudge the player towards a certain type of activity. And in that case, it's withdrawing. So what's happening here is that's a study which will come out soon, hopefully later this year or in December. In that study, we nudge players to withdraw money after they have won, a significant amount. And we found that this works very well, much better than actually intercepting or messaging players after they have experienced a long losing streak. I think that's it, right? Yeah. So for more information, reach out to me or one of my co-panelists, and I'll give back the word to Maris.
Great, and we do have some questions for you already. One of them is, can normative feedback actually lead to a negative change?
Okay, yeah, I get the question very often. So, so we didn't find that so far. So, I mean, the idea here is maybe for the others that if somebody gambles very little and then there is feedback, right, telling them, okay, you only, I don't know, deposit 50 euros a month and the average player deposits 200, why wouldn't they sort of deposit more? We didn't find that so far. On the other hand, there is probably little less harm done if somebody, you know, a recreational player gambling very little would sort of, you know, spend a little bit more. The main goal of the normative feedback, of course, is to sort of provide like sort of, you know, an entry into a stages of change for somebody who spends a lot and they're not aware of it.
I think another question from this was, how can you effectively group the peers though? Do you do it by age, by spend?
Not by spend, of course, because that sort of would, I mean, like wouldn't really be helpful, but by structural characteristics, so by game types. So we would group by, you know, preferred game type. Is it sports betting? Is it slots? Is it poker? And so on and so forth. Because of course, a typical, you know, player who's sort of deposits majority go to poker wouldn't sort of, you know, want to connect, doesn't feel connected to somebody playing the slots. And that's important in terms of accepting or, you know, endorsing and that type of feedback.
Cool. You're getting quite a few questions. The other one, I'll join these two together. So how did you select the customers that had to take a break? Like who should stop at 90 seconds, 5 minutes, or 15 minutes? And why did you stop at 15 minutes?
Yeah, this was a completely 100% randomized control trial. This study, and I think we published 3 studies in total, was done with Norsk Tipping's player base, and they so we assigned all the active online casino players for the previous 3 months into one of 3 groups and randomly. And then during the month of, let's say, now we would have December, players would continuously receive only one type of play break, 90 seconds, 5 minutes, or 15 minutes. And so completely controlled, randomized trial, just like you would conduct, you know, a pharmaceutical trial or something like that. So you can draw really cause and effect relationships. And why would you stop at 50 minutes? Simply because, you know, of the size of the experimental groups, because this wasn't the only thing that we did. We also had groups based on personalized feedback. So in the examples, you saw that players also were told that's how much they already lost or spent, and some groups didn't. But we didn't find any significant difference. So it didn't matter whether we told them you lost 1,000 Norwegian krona in the last hour or not, with respect to them starting to gamble again. So it was fully randomized, controlled trial in a real world online casino setting, which is very rare, because you have to work with the operator, of course, to do that.
That's super interesting. I know a lot of operators who wouldn't even have accepted 15 minutes, to be fair. If I had to get in some other people as well in this discussion, so if I had to look at Jim right now, so we talk a lot about interventions, we talk a lot about measuring success, but we have researchers and lived experience. But what about the operator? So are there any techniques or strategies that you feel that have been proven effective? Are there any learnings that you see firsthand in Flutter?
Yes, I think firstly, it's really important to know what behavior you're trying to drive from the interaction. So, for example, if a player has been playing too frequently or too often or for too long a duration, obviously you want to try and, you know, reduce that a little bit. If somebody's having, you know, spending a lot, high losses, you want to reduce that. So before you kind of start measuring the success, you need to be clear about what behavior you're trying to drive. What we have found at Flutter is that we have a pop-up that appears for players who are depositing and playing a high level of casino games, and that's a real-time pop-up. And we found that is pretty effective at slowing those players down. So the real-time nature of that interaction, you know, whilst a player is potentially losing control of their gambling or not sort of making rational decisions, a nudge there or a pop-up we found is effective and more effective. We also have processes which send out emails to players, not in real time, as a sort of batch process. And whilst they are, you know, the open rates are fairly high, we found that they're not quite as effective as a sort of real-time intervention. So I think that would be sort of the main takeaway from us. And I think also, I mean, we have well over 1 million active players per month at Flutter International. So the majority of our interactions are automated out of necessity. And something that we're focusing on in the coming year is improving the personalization of those automatic contacts. So a generic email or a generic pop-up, it might be good, but a more personalized pop-up to highlight the specific behavior that is potentially concerning is way more powerful. So that's what we're looking to really improve on in the coming year.
And Dan, hi. So obviously through Epic you get to see a lot of operators. So you get to see the different maybe approaches, the different appetites from different operators. Did you see anything that was like, okay, this is good, you know, this should be something that is in the regulation?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Good to be back this year. Feels like a year's gone awfully quickly since the previous one. Thanks for the question, Maris. Yeah, I think just for those that don't know what Epic do, we're consultants in the lived experience space. So I'm somebody who's lived through gambling addiction, similar to Claire. And we use those experiences along with our work over the last 10 years with operators to kind of hone the way that we identify and interact with the players. And I think in answer to your question, it does put us in a very privileged space because we get to see, you know, we work with the biggest gambling operators in the world and we get to see what they're all doing. And that puts us in a really good kind of space to kind of advise what works and what doesn't and what challenges are likely to come up. I think, unfortunately, the answer is that the best programs will come from collaboration. And I don't think we're too far away from that now. We do see our clients starting to speak to each other about what's in development, not just what's kind of publicly out there at the moment. We get a lot of clients duplicating each other's work, you know, doing the same thing. And I think we should all be on the same page now that we are not in competition when it comes to safer gambling. You know, we should all be on the same page that we know that safer gambling equals commercial success. You know, the only competition is with the operators that choose not to do it or they choose just to comply. When it comes to excellence in safer gambling, we should all be looking to level each other up. So I think, yes, collaboration will be the next step forward. I think we're nearing the point where operators can have got as far as they can get in terms of doing it on their own. I think the bigger data set, as Michael showed earlier, the better kind of direction you get of where you can go. I think models are getting more and more sophisticated, like we saw with Neccton. We work with Mindway as well as kind of programs that have formed their own way. Arc would be a fantastic example from Entain, where they've got detection methods. They've plugged in baselines to kind of pitch themselves against. They're looking at 26 markers of protection. And I think that the secret sauce here is looking at the 3 main ways that people can cause harm with their gambling. And for me, they are money, time, and cognition. You know, are they spending more than they can afford? You know, are they spending all week, including time that shouldn't be for gambling, you know, when they should be working or sleeping or doing something else? And cognitively, is that brain space kind of taken up by this subject matter, and they're kind of leaving behind responsibilities in their rest of their lives? And I think the most difficult one, and perhaps the most important one, is how do you measure that cognitive harm in people? Because that is kind of the untouched one of the 3. You know, we were all on board with financial harm. We have been for years. It's very, very easy to measure. The UK have gone further in kind of affordability-based conversations. I think there's still a gap between the UK and the rest of Europe, and certainly America and other international markets. Time we're kind of getting on board with now. You know, we're measuring late night play. We're measuring outliers, and outliers should be treated like outliers. You know, that when it comes to tailored messaging, normative play, I think that's very important. The cognitive harm is the next point, and for me, the best method we have of doing that is a human to human conversation. You know, I think that's where we are now.
Just trying to be skeptical, because that's my job. So obviously we hear a lot about these things. Obviously the operators are doing this because they care more about their license at times than helping people, because obviously if you don't do it properly you can get a fine. Claire, you're coming with a wealth of experience through your lived experience. How can operators really evaluate the effectiveness of their interactions? Is it just, you know, fine, someone is detected, we send a pop-up, they stop playing, the risk is no longer ours? Is there stages where some of them would work and others would just, you know, push the gambler somewhere else?
Yeah, thanks, Maris. Obviously, I can only speak from my own experience. However, I gambled for years problematically with many operators, and at the time I was depositing money very frequently. And the most interaction I ever received was through chat, and that was really only because I was doing what was known as bonus begging. And that chat interaction consisted of a question, which was basically, do you think you might have a problem with gambling? And then me saying no, and that was it. Now, as someone with a gambling addiction at the time, I was a pathological liar, and I would have said anything or done anything to protect my gambling. And there was a company that did the pop-ups, which would remind me of the length of time I'd been playing. But to be honest, they just made me angry, and I saw them as a hindrance. I think that on Tuesday's webinar on markers of harm, Mark Griffiths made a very good point, and it's something that I spoke about at SGC last year. But if tools such as setting deposit limits and time limits were introduced as mandatory steps in the account registration process, I do believe this would help to minimize the likelihood of harm. But there is one point that I really wanted to get across today, and again, I can only speak to my own experience of this, but I think if an operator suspects that a customer is at risk of harm, the worst thing they can do is freeze that customer's account. And I'll go back to Dan's point about that cognition, or whatever you want to refer to it as, but you know, from my point of view, it might seem logical for the operator to freeze that account. It seems like the logical step, but you're not dealing in the realm of logic with someone like me. If you do that, you're actually driving further irrational behavior, because if you cut off what I see as a potential path to solving some of my financial pressures, then I'm going to feel desperate and forced to locate another source of potential income. And that's going to lead to irrational and potentially dangerous behavior on my end, which you're not going to see.
Which is quite difficult though, because if you're an operator, you do care about the liability from your end. You know, you're not a therapist to a certain extent. We do have some questions. I'm trying to gather them all together because we're getting quite a few. There is a question about, can we rank the RG interaction types by efficiency? And then there's another question which goes on the telephone conversation, the more personal touch. So what's your opinion? We have operators with experience and researchers. What do you think it's perhaps the best way to rank these things? And is it that easy to rank, or should it be then maybe a different aspect of the gambler's life cycle that we're looking into? Who wants to try to go first? Shall I pick on Michael? I think Michael, yes.
Yeah,
go for it.
I really this really connects very well with Claire's experience. And I mean, you made a really perfect point with the limits. And the limits, like if the limits, I mean, the limits should of course be mandatory, so everybody should have to set the limit at registration, or maybe even be assigned a limit based on, you know, like information that they provide. Okay, how much do I have available, etc., because this makes you think about it. And in Spain, I think, or I mean, it is so. In Spain, there are limits that you are assigned to you at account registration. I think 500 daily to 1500 weekly or something like that. However, somebody can change it, but there is a limit. And I think this is something, you know, every like regulation, modern regulation should sort of prescribe. There has to be a limit, or a player has to set a limit when they register. And it comes down to life cycle, because this is prevention. And all the data that we have, I mean, responsible gaming tools, what they should really be used for is prevention. The other, I mean, extreme, what you said before, okay, you know, you become a pathological liar, you don't think logically anymore, right? You distort reality to fit into your sort of, you know, desperation at the end of the day. Nothing helps anymore at that point of time. But we should try with the responsible gaming tools to prevent, you know, somebody from reaching, you know, that stage, because at that stage it's the conversation, you know, the professional conversations, psychological treatment, etc., that helps. And that's why I don't think you can rank, you know, the tools by efficiency, but a limit. You know, there are studies which came to the conclusion voluntary limits don't work. I don't support that at all, because it comes down to how are voluntary limits actually implemented. And if the voluntary limit, you know, pops up when you register and you are frequently asked, are you sure, you know, you'd like to keep that limit? Would you like to change your limit once you hit it? Or let's say we also published a study with limit reminders. So what some operators do is, once you start reaching your limit, you receive a reminder, hey, you've reached 80% of your limit, etc., etc. Would you like to change it? I mean, there are so many things that can be done around the limits to make them more efficiently.
I think,
in fact, sorry,
Michael,
one of the questions, just to, because it links very directly to this, is what if people just set up unreasonable large limits? Doesn't really make a difference then. Yes, sorry, Jim.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to say, I think Michael made a really good point about trying to prevent people from experiencing severe harm. So one of the focuses that we have, and I think is sensible for every operator, is to try and detect possible signs of harm at the earliest possible stage, and where those it might be quite mild at a very early stage, but interacting with those players in a personalized fashion, just to say, hey, you know, we've noticed perhaps you have a tendency to chase your losses. Perhaps the losses aren't concerning, but even that behavior at a very sort of embryonic stage, in an ideal world, we would pick up on that and we'd interact with that player right there and then to say, hey, we've noticed this, or, you know, we'd obviously take advice on how to frame the text of the interaction, but just to make the player aware that we have noticed, and perhaps in their own head, maybe they're not even aware of that right now, but we've noticed that, and we can give them a nudge, and that's something that we're looking to improve on in the coming years, is highlighting those marks of harm at the early stages, and then hopefully preventing that player then from going on to develop a more serious problem.
Dan and Claire, would the limit have really helped? Maybe more towards Dan, if an operator had pushed you, let's say at the point of there was already the destructive behavior going on, and you got the pop-up that you need to set a limit, would it have really helped?
I think it does help players. I think in my specific case study, Maris, you know, I had over 75 online gambling accounts at the height of my gambling. So to a lot of degrees, I kind of flew under the radar of a lot of these detection methods that were available. 6 years ago when I was gambling. From a financial point of view, I wasn't hitting any of those thresholds because my spend was spread over so many different accounts. From a time point of view, exactly the same thing happened. And I think Claire's point is a really important one about, you know, do you keep a player playing where they are, or do you close their account down? It's not a point that comes up often, because I think it's an uncomfortable one for the industry to talk about. From a compliance point of view, of course, we shouldn't be keeping problematic gamblers for ourselves because we think we're the ones that can look after them the best. However, I think I would challenge that back and kind of say that detecting problematic gamblers and closing the account is not the aim of the game here. You know, if that's your game plan, if that's your strategy, you are failing as an operator to look after your customers here. It's very much what Jim said about getting there at an earlier stage, detecting the behavioural change and not creating problematic gamblers, because not every problematic gambler comes out of the ether onto your site and is ready formed. You know, this happens under operators' umbrellas. So I think that early stage interaction is really important. In international markets, as Jim said, you know, we are using automatic interventions because in a growing market, it's just not viable to have huge call centers that are contacting customers, you know, every few months, as much as I would like that to be the case. But that is the case across Europe. You know, that is the case certainly in the UK, where we do have call centres that are proactively reaching out, educating people about tools, finding the right one for them, convincing them that this is a good thing to have in place for them. And I think the trick here is not quantity, it's very much quality. It's about how do we use tools like Michael's or Mindways or any of the other dashboards out there that can find the right customers, so that we have an efficient operation to talk to the right customers, to make sure that when you pick up that phone, you're getting through to me or Claire back in the time that we were gambling, and not some recreational player who you're just going to be harassing, not some VIP who you don't really understand what their affordability level is, but actually you're talking to someone who really is experiencing harm. Because even though I went underneath all of those thresholds, you know, I was at the point of suicidal ideation because of my gambling, even though my spend was quite low, because it was just completely unaffordable. And just one more point before I move on about normative play and kind of the antithesis to that, you know, having the unintended consequence. One of the things that was going through my head when I was gambling is that I was not an outlier. I was a low-level spender, because the loyalty schemes back then, I was kind of like a silver member, whereas above me there was gold, there was platinum, there was crystal, there was superstar. There's all these people playing way more than I am, but actually that wasn't true, because that was based on spend. You know, that wasn't based on time and cognition, you know, the two ways that I was causing the most harm.
Just, can I quickly say something?
Yeah.
About that. So what we tried, you know, last couple of years to really, you know, find indicators which are independent of amount spent, like behavioral aspects, and those would have, you know, most likely picked up your behavior, because although you didn't spend a lot in terms of money, you spent a lot of time, but there are other things like you know, Jim said before, chasing within the sessions, depositing, you know, frequently, reloading your wallet, using multiple payment accounts, those kinds of things, and those sort of detach from the actual spend. And I'm totally in line with you. It's not about detecting, you know, the already problematic gambler, but, you know, to identify behavioral aspects that are, you know, independent of how much somebody spends, because that also creates an issue across jurisdictions. You know, if you do this in the UK, in Canada, US, in Romania, etc., you might have to change thresholds because of different, you know, average level of income. But if you focus more on behavioral aspects, then, you know, you get rid of actually this painful threshold discussion. You know, is it €1,000, $1,000, whatever? I mean, there is no line that you can draw, because people have different, you know, financial backgrounds.
And I think on that point as well is one of the topics that you touched on in your slides about chasing winnings.
Yep.
So obviously, if something makes you feel good, if you win, you're going to chase that feeling. Can you give us maybe a bit more information on the interventions that you think would help there?
I mean, the chasing after the winnings, sort of. I mean, I had one, like one epiphany about that when I saw the data, because sometimes you see data, but you didn't anticipate it, and then you try to explain, right, why the data are the way they are with psychological theories, and it fits prospect theory perfectly, because if I give you 10,000 euros and take it away, you losing the 10,000 euros hurts you much more than receiving the 10,000, right? So whenever you lose something, it hurts us much more compared like to the pleasure we receive of getting it. And what we did is, like, what we do is, we look at the maximum balance somebody might have in a session, and somebody might go up, I don't know, to 500 euros, 1,000 pounds, whatever, and then they lose everything again. And then we see, they are much more desperate after, they have lost it, to come back, to sort of, to that balance, compared to somebody who just loses from the start, right? They will stop at some point of time. But if you once manage to go up there and then, it's gone again, then you try to win it back. And again, I mean, I'm sure, Jim and they do it because they have, the technological setup for it. That's a good point of time to intercept, I mean, real time, of course, you gotta do it, because the balance is, very volatile metric.
And I think directing to Jim actually on this question, because we know that, the commercial departments are usually quite bigger than the player safety department. And if you have a customer who just hit a jackpot, there's a very high chance that the commercial team will tell you, let him lose it back. So what's your opinion on that? How can you get buy-in from the company to protect the person, but also at the same time try to get commercial to have that buy-in?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, we work really closely with our commercial teams on every single initiative, because obviously, I guess the perception is that safer gambling is a net sort of negative to the bottom line, and it's that sort of perception that I think every safer gambling team in operators are trying to change. Is that, yes, if you encourage somebody to cash out, so they've won £10,000 and they cash out, I don't know, 9.5 and then play with the rest, then they haven't lost it all back, and then that's money off the bottom line. However, we do see players who win substantial amounts and give it all back within a few hours, and that's not great from the player's perspective, certainly. However, encouraging someone to cash out, if that player has a more positive experience and that leads them to play sustainably, we might then have a player who, say, spends £200 a month over 20 years, rather than somebody who spends, say, £4,000 in a month and then disappears or self-excludes or goes dormant. So both in terms of sort of longer term sustainability and profitability, it's better to have a more sustainable playing base. And initiatives like that, I think, are a really, really good idea. There is obviously a difference between regulatory driven projects, which everyone has to do and will have an impact, and the things that we want to do because we think they're the right thing to do, but a regulator isn't telling us to do that. And for those types of projects, I think the general culture of the company is really important, the safer gambling culture, which has to come from the very top and has to be sort of infused within every single team, regardless of whether they're customer facing or they're marketing or they're advertising or they're, whatever it is they do. We need to make them aware of the importance of safer gambling. And just at Flutter International, a significant portion of everybody's bonus, regardless of role, is linked to our safer gambling performance. So I think things like that are good, because now everyone cares how well the safer gambling team does, because it directly impacts them, financially at the end of the year. So there are difficult conversations for sure, and there will be a it is a bit of a balancing act, because, you know, we could say, right, everyone has £10 a week deposit limit, it's not going to change, and they're, you know, you probably eliminate 99% of all problem gamblers. That would be obviously disastrous commercially. So somewhere there will be the middle point, and it's just ensuring that the safer gambling voice is strong in those conversations, and we strike the right balance.
Can I come in on this, Matt?
Of course.
Thank you. So this was probably some of the most interesting work that I did this year with a couple of clients, was on big winners. And it's probably the most progress what I've seen kind of happen in this space in the last few years. And just take you through some of the things that we did. You know, talking to the operators in the room here now, if you've not got somebody in your safer gambling team, probably at the highest level, that's probably director level, that got the authority to manually cash out a customer, then you're behind the curve. You know, if you don't have someone in your safer gambling interactions team that's particularly in charge of speaking to winners rather than losing players, then you're behind the curve. If your algorithms can't detect that, you're behind the curve. We did some training specifically on kind of how to deal with winning players and making sure that they don't turn into problematic players. Things like how do you tailor those interactions? One of my favorite tips was a really effective question to ask that winning player is, who have you told? Who have you told that you've won? It's really putting a full stop on the end of that kind of period of play. And if you haven't told anyone, then of course you're more at risk of kind of losing all the money back without being accountable for it. You know, who have you told? What are you going to do with the money? That kind of congratulatory call is a really important part of the process. And those clients now have different scripts for people that are having safer gambling interactions because of a win rather than a loss. And I think that was probably some of the most interesting stuff we did. One of the functions that we complete is that we've got 28 people within Epic Risk Management and Epic Restart that have lived experience. We're a real community of people that have been working with operators for a number of years. So we can get a focus group together very quickly, and that was instrumental in getting kind of those processes put in place for those clients.
But if I look at Claire again, I'm going to be a bit skeptic in this. If you have a big win and now the operator is talking to you, I personally would be quite pissed off, saying, now you're talking to me after I win. And I would try to chase that winning feeling, as we see from the research from Michael and Mark. From your end, Claire, from seeing that lived experience, how can you really break that cycle? I love the idea of Dan that you ask, did you tell someone? Because that will break the hidden aspect of gambling. But is there something else that the operators can learn from first-hand experience on the topic?
I think it's a very difficult one from the operator perspective, if I'm honest. The first thing I would say, like, I've worked with a lot of recovering gamblers over the years who are going to say that winning was the worst thing that ever happened to them. And the thing is, like, from your perspective, you can't know if I'm chasing a win because I could be doing it with 100 operators, realistically. Because there could be several wins there. But saying that, and I know I bang on about this a lot, and you're probably sick of listening to me, but the fact that the reverse withdrawal button is still in use is absolutely baffling to me. And I mean, we can sit here all day and we can talk about the data and what that tells us, but in reality, I would challenge you to go out and actually speak to your customer base and ask them how they feel about it, because I can guarantee you not one person is going to say they want that option to be there. It serves absolutely no purpose, and in all honesty, anyone who's still using it, that can't be seen as promoting safer gambling. I went a little bit on tangent there. What was the original question, Maris?
It's okay. I think the cancelled withdrawal thing also goes quite hand in hand with chasing winnings. I've also seen with the Dutch regulator that they have balance limits, which I really like. So you set up a limit and you can never have more than that amount as your balance. So it's very difficult to chase winnings in that perspective. We got a lot of questions coming in, but we don't have enough time. And I had quite a few questions prepared as well. One thing that I'm thinking of asking, because it's quite a hot topic as well, is that we hear so much from academics, we hear from first-hand operators and lived experience. And for example, something which is that I also believe in is you don't just close an account if there's high risk. But as mentioned by quite a few people in the, here in the audience, is that the gambling commission is saying the opposite. So what can the operators do? And is there enough, do you think, collaboration, communication then with lived experience and regulators? Should there be more? I don't know who wants to answer this one first.
There's a lot on the regulator here. I think we put a lot of pressure on the industry and the operators to implement all these different things, but realistically it's down to the regulators to enforce a lot of this stuff to happen, because you can enforce it, but is the other company enforcing it? Because we might just run away to that other company otherwise. I think that I think I said this last year, like, who's the person on the end of the phone? You know, who's the person who's ringing me and talking to me when I'm in that dire place? There's a lot of generic, like the generic pop-up, you know, the person who works for the operator. What do I know about them? What do they know about me? Am I really going to have a conversation where they're going to change my life and make me see where I need to be and where I shouldn't be? That's just my perspective on it. Like, I feel like there's a connection missing there somewhere, but it's not an easy one from your perspective to solve.
You know, if any of the others want to chip in very briefly, because we're running out of time.
I'll be brief. You know, lived experience never used to be part of the conversation. You know, this has really happened. It's grown a lot in the last 5 years. You know, to have someone like me and Claire in this conversation here, I think is great. And I think operators are open to that now. You know, we're working with a lot of clients across the world, and even in America, you know, emerging markets, they're kind of on board from day one. I think the missing link is the regulators. You know, I'm still not having enough conversations with regulators. I have conversations with government, with DCMS in the UK and stuff like that. The regulators are still, for me, a little bit at arm's length from talking to us. And I'd like to be more in that conversation, because, you know, collaboration is the real key to this. And, you know, Claire, just to respond to you, who's that person on the end of the phone? They're those call centers that we're training. You know, we're getting lived experience people in front of them, telling their story about how the harm affected them and how they can have these conversations. And I'd love to invite you to come and witness that sometime. Come and jump in one of our sessions.
Yeah, because that is the point, isn't it? Like, they need to see the real story behind it and understand it. And I think that, like Dan says, you know, involving us is the key realistically to changing that interaction.
So we have 2 minutes left. Just to say to everyone who sent in a question, we'll try to gather all these questions and I'll speak to the EGBA. Maybe we can formulate the answers, because it's been great. I asked this question in another webinar yesterday and I loved the answers. So I'm going to ask it to you guys now. I'm prepared. So if you had to have one wish on what to do for safer gambling, what could it be? And you have like 30 seconds each to answer it. So let's start with Jim.
So something that we're investigating with our data science team at the moment actually is a more predictive model. So this is the player's safer gambling risk today. Based on what we've seen, what do we think? Where do we think this player is going to be in 2 weeks, in a month, in 3 months? So again, on the theme of early interaction and intervention.
Dan?
I would love it if everybody who works in the industry has heard a story of a lived experience individual that's gone through harm. I think that if you work in this industry, you owe it to yourself to hear those stories and truly understand what can go wrong and what happens when it does go wrong.
Michael?
I'd like, you know, to drive more cooperations with operators to really understand gambling behavior, collect self-reported information from players, and, you know, continue like real high qualitative randomized control research.
Amazing. Claire, now that they took all the ideas?
Look, it's very simple for me. Get rid of reverse withdrawal. If you're still using it, it is evil.
I think it should become regulation in every regulator.
Good point.
But yeah, we'll wait for that. From my end, thank you. It's been a pleasure. I'm really sorry we didn't manage to get through the questions. They were storming in, but that just shows how good the discussion was doing. There were a few other points that we had prepared, but we didn't have the time. Thanks, Jim, Dan, Michael, and Claire for attending and for putting up with me, and thank you to EGBA to organize this. We'll try to circumvent we'll try to send all the questions and some answers as well. And this recording will be available by tomorrow, I think. Okay, cool. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mary.